In the fog-shrouded hills of 1840s Virginia, a woman with blood on her hands and truth in her pen witnessed every cry of the newborn. She never spoke. She only wrote. And when her notebooks finally surfaced after her death, they did not merely expose secrets. They called down divine fire on one of the South's most untouchable families. This is the story of Harriet Voss, the midwife who became God's silent witness. The Blue Ridge Mountains in October 1841 did not simply change color. They burned. Amber light bled through the thinning leaves like the last warning of a wrathful God before winter sealed the valley in judgment. The air tasted of wood smoke and coming frost. Every footstep on the muddy roads carried farther than it should, wagon wheels cracking like bones, dogs answering one another across miles of silence, and then, the unmistakable rhythm of a woman walking fast. Leather bag slapping against her hip. Breath steady. Eyes already seeing what no one else wanted seen. That rhythm meant a child was fighting its way into a world that would never be ready for it. Harriet Voss arrived at Westmere Plantation on a Thursday that smelled of rain and regret. She was 41 years old, compact, deliberate, the kind of woman whose presence made rooms grow quieter without her ever raising her voice. Her hands, rough from lye soap and years of guiding life through pain, never trembled. Not once. People would later say her eyes were watchful, but that word was too soft. They were recording. As though every detail she witnessed was being written straight onto her soul before it ever touched paper. She had come from a hardscrabble settlement north of Charlottesville, trained by a woman named Agnes who believed midwifery was not a trade but a sacred accountability. Cleanliness is next to godliness, Agnes used to say, and record-keeping is next to justice. Harriet had taken both commandments to heart. She had been married once to a tanner named Carl who died coughing up his own lungs in 1827. No children. No bitterness. Only a name she kept like a shield and a quiet understanding that some women were meant to bring life into the world while others were meant to remember how it arrived. By 1841, Harriet had delivered more than 200 babies across Albemarle County. She asked for payment only from those who could spare it. From the enslaved women in the quarter she asked nothing at all except the truth when the child came. Because Harriet Voss understood something the powerful men around her refused to see, the very first breath a child draws is the only moment its blood tells the truth. Before lies are written into family Bibles. Before lawyers rewrite inheritance. Before the world agrees on which children are legitimate and which are simply inconvenient. The Langford family of Westmere believed they were untouchable. Their land grant stretched back to the earliest colonial charters. 4,000 acres of tobacco, timber, and rich bottomland. 60 to 90 enslaved souls, numbers that rose and fell with the harvest like livestock tallies. Edmund Langford, 58 years old, patriarch, church elder, and master of everything he surveyed, ruled with the calm certainty of a man who had never once been told no by God or man. Until the day his wife Adelaide nearly bled out during what the family physician called a routine examination. Dr. Harlan Pute, expensive, discreet, and terrified of losing the Langford account, suggested a resident midwife. Someone always on the property. Someone who could watch Adelaide's fragile health and attend to the needs of the household's female population. Edmund agreed. Not because he feared for his wife. Because he feared scandal. 2 weeks later Harriet Voss stepped through the back door of Westmere with nothing but her bag, her Bible, and the first of many plain leather notebooks. The notebook looked harmless. Dark brown calfskin. Cream pages. The kind any storekeeper sold for keeping accounts. But inside its pages, Harriet would record what the family Bible never would. She began the very first night. November 14, 1841. The mother's name was Nora, 19, perhaps 20, no one knew for certain because her own birth had never been written down anywhere except as one female child, inventory value $300. She worked in the kitchen. Small. Terrified. The older women in the quarters had tried to prepare her, but plantation life had stolen their teachers. 2 grandmothers dead in the last fever season. No one left to tell Nora what her body was about to do. Harriet stayed 7 hours. Candlelight flickered across sweat-slick skin. The air was thick with the iron scent of blood and the sharp green smell of the herbs Harriet had steeped in advance. Nora's cries rose and fell like waves against a storm wall. Harriet's voice never rose above a murmur. "Breathe with me, child. The Lord is near." The baby came just before midnight, a boy, strong, lungs full of righteous anger. 7 pounds by Harriet's practiced hands. Perfect. Alive. Nora wept the way only a mother who already knows her child's chains can weep. When the danger passed and Nora slept, Harriet sat on a low stool, opened her notebook by the single candle the overseer allowed, and wrote with the steady hand of a woman who knew she was doing holy work. November 14, 1841. Mother, Nora, kitchen. Child, male, healthy, 7 pounds. No name given yet. Father, name withheld at first. After reassurance of secrecy, mother stated, E.L. She paused. The candle guttered. Outside, the wind moved through the slave quarters like a warning. E.L. Edmund Langford. Harriet did not gasp. She did not judge aloud. She simply wrote the truth, the way a scribe in the courts of heaven might write it, without flourish, without mercy, without fear. Because Harriet Voss had already seen enough of plantation life to know that some sins wore fine coats and quoted scripture on Sunday while they planted bastards in the quarters on Monday. She closed the book, slid it into the deep pocket of her apron, and became invisible. That invisibility was her greatest weapon. She rose before dawn, prepared her salves and tinctures, walked the quarters checking on the sick, sat with Adelaide Langford through long afternoons of frailty, and never spoke more than necessary. The enslaved women began to call her Miss Harriet with a reverence usually reserved for preachers. The white family barely noticed her at all, exactly as she intended. But the notebook grew. And with it grew something heavier than paper and ink. A record of divine witness. Because every child born at Westmere, whether in the big house with silk sheets or in the quarters on cornshuck pallets, was written down exactly as heaven had seen it arrive. Skin tone. Eye color. The shape of the mouth that looked a little too much like the master's. The trembling confessions whispered between contractions. The names the mothers dared to speak only when pain stripped them of caution. Harriet wrote it all. Not out of rebellion. Not out of politics. But because she believed deep in the marrow of her bones that the God who numbered the hairs on every head also numbered every lie told to protect a fortune built on stolen blood and stolen pleasure. And one day, that God would demand an accounting. By spring of 1842, the household had settled into a rhythm that felt almost peaceful. Adelaide Langford's color returned. Edmund Sr. paid Harriet's modest wage without comment. Charles Langford, the eldest son, 22, already carved from the same cold marble as his father, barely glanced at the quiet midwife who moved through his world like a shadow. But shadows, as Harriet knew, are where secrets breed. In 1845, Charles married Eleanor Holt, daughter of a neighboring planter. A slender, watchful woman whose eyes reminded Harriet of a deer that had already seen the hunter's rifle. Their first child, a boy named Edmund Holt Langford, arrived on a bitter January night in 1847. Snow hissed against the window panes. Charles paced the hallway like a caged wolf. Inside the birthing room, Eleanor gripped Harriet's hand until the knuckles went white. The boy was perfect. Legitimate. Recorded in the family Bible with gold ink and pride. Harriet wrote the entry anyway, calm, precise, almost gentle. January 12, 1847. Mother, Eleanor Holt Langford. Child, male, healthy. Name, Edmund Holt Langford. Father, Charles Langford, husband. Delivery without complication. Both in good condition. She added nothing more. Some truths did not need underlining. But other truths screamed between the lines. Thomas Langford, younger brother, restless, drink-haunted, married Vivian Carr in 1851. A widow 7 years his senior who carried herself like a woman who had already survived one war and expected another. Harriet watched her closely during the pregnancy. Saw the way Vivian's hands trembled when she thought no one was looking. Saw the way her eyes searched Harriet's face for something she could not name. The boy Robert came in the spring of 1852 after a labor that seemed to cost Vivian more than flesh. Harriet wrote, Mother, Vivian Carr Langford. Child, male, healthy. Father, Thomas Langford, husband. Physical condition of mother suggests inner burden beyond the child. She closed the book and felt, for the first time, the full weight of what she was carrying. Not paper. Not ink. A ledger of divine reckoning. Edmund Langford Sr. died in March 1853 at the age of 69. Heart failure, the doctor said. The family called it a peaceful passing. Harriet stood at the edge of the funeral crowd, black shawl tied around her shoulders, and watched Charles accept condolences with the same measured calm his father had worn like armor. She watched Thomas weep too loudly, too publicly. She watched Eleanor's fingers dig into her husband's arm like claws. And that night, alone in her narrow room behind the kitchen, Harriet opened her current notebook and added one brief line beneath the date. March 14, 1853. Edmund Langford, Sr., deceased. Estate passes to eldest son Charles. No outward complication. Then she paused. The candle flame bent as though someone invisible had just walked past. Harriet stared at the page for a long moment, the way a woman might stare at the edge of a cliff she knows she will one day be forced to push someone over. She did not write the thought that came next. She did not need to. Because the notebook already knew. And somewhere, in the silence between heartbeats, Harriet Voss felt the first cold breath of what was coming. A reckoning written in the blood of every child she had ever delivered. A reckoning no fortune, no lawyer, no prayer could stop. Because the truth about where a child really comes from is written in the first moment of life. And Harriet Voss had written it all down. The years after Edmund Langford Sr.'s death were not peaceful. They were the slow unraveling of a dynasty that had mistaken control for immortality. Charles Langford stepped into his father's shadow not as a conqueror, but as a careful steward, methodical, cold-eyed, unwilling to let even 1 acre slip through inefficiency. Tobacco fields expanded under his orders. New plows turned richer soil. Rotations were planned with the precision of a man who believed fortune could be engineered through discipline alone. But discipline cannot bind a man like Thomas Langford. Thomas drank deeper now. His ventures, always brilliant in the first flush of enthusiasm, collapsed with predictable violence. He vanished for weeks, sometimes months, returning with the sour smell of cheap whiskey and the sharper smell of failure. His resentment toward Charles had hardened into something almost mineral, not loud rage, but a quiet, corrosive certainty that he had been robbed by birth order alone. The estate's division had followed Virginia custom: eldest son takes the lion's share, but Thomas had rewritten the story in his own mind until it became theft. Harriet Voss watched it all without comment. She moved through Westmere like breath, necessary, unnoticed, constant. She tended fevers, set bones, eased the passage of children into a world already scarred by war's approach. And she wrote. Always she wrote. In late August 1857 she was called to a tenant farm on the county's ragged edge, no direct tie to Westmere, yet close enough that whispers traveled. The woman was Margaret Dyer, 25, unmarried, alone. Labor came clean. The boy arrived strong, lungs full, skin the warm brown of riverbank clay after rain. Harriet cleaned the child, wrapped him, handed him to his mother. Then she looked at the shape of the infant's ears, the faint cleft in the chin, the way the tiny mouth curved even in sleep. She asked, softly, as she had asked 100 times before. Margaret's voice cracked only once. Thomas Langford. Harriet wrote the name without hesitation. No flourish. No exclamation. Just ink on paper, steady as a heartbeat. She walked the 3 miles back to Westmere under a sky turning the color of bruised plums. The notebook went into the tin-lined box beneath her bed. She washed her hands in the basin, said morning prayers, and began the day's work as though nothing had changed. But everything had. 2 years passed like slow poison. In the spring of 1859, Vivian Langford came to Harriet's small room after full dark. She moved with deliberate lightness, too deliberate. She spoke of trivial things first: a headache, the dampness in the air, the way the war talk was making everyone restless. Then, almost as an afterthought, Harriet, have you ever attended a woman named Margaret Dyer? Harriet met her eyes without blinking. "I attend many women, Mrs. Langford. My records are confidential. Always." Vivian held the silence for 3 heartbeats. Then she nodded once, slow, grateful, satisfied, and left. She had not come for denial. She had come for the shape of the refusal. And Harriet had given it to her. Vivian Langford was no longer simply a wife in a precarious marriage. She had become a woman building fortifications against collapse. Thomas's absences grew longer. His debts multiplied like rabbits in spring. The allowance Charles dispensed was enough for comfort, not security. And Vivian, sharp, quiet, survivor, understood that comfort is the first thing to vanish when a man's vices outrun his income. She had pieced together the story of Margaret Dyer not from Harriet, but from the invisible currents women maintain, servants' glances, timing of departures, the way certain children in the county bore an unmistakable echo of Langford features. She had not needed confirmation of the act itself. She needed confirmation of evidence. Harriet had given her neither yes nor no. That was answer enough. From that night forward, Vivian began a careful courtship of Harriet Voss. Small gifts appeared on the workbench: a jar of peach preserves, a length of good linen, a packet of fine needles. Each offering came wrapped in polite thanks that lingered just a shade longer than custom required. Harriet accepted them with the same calm courtesy she offered everyone. She never initiated. She never refused. She simply observed. And she kept writing. The nation split open in 1861. Virginia chose the Confederacy with the grim inevitability of a man stepping off a cliff he has already mapped. Charles managed the war years the way he managed everything: quietly, ruthlessly, profitably where possible. Westmere was spared burning. Union troops passed nearby but never lingered. The enslaved population began to slip away even before the Emancipation Proclamation, first in trickles, then in waves after freedom became law. Fields shrank. Profits withered. Charles adapted. He leased land. He hired free labor at market rates. He calculated survival. Thomas did not adapt. He drank until the bottle became his only steady companion. He quarreled with Charles until the arguments echoed through the big house like distant cannon. In 1863, typhoid took him to the edge of death. Vivian nursed him through delirium and sweat and terror. When he returned to consciousness, thinner, paler, diminished, he thanked her with the awkward gratitude of a man who knows he has been carried across a chasm he cannot remember crossing. She accepted the thanks without warmth or rancor. She continued to watch. Harriet, now in her early 60s, remained indispensable. Physicians were scarce, many dead, many in uniform. She delivered 5 children during the war years at Westmere. 1 to a hired white laborer's wife. 4 to women who had once been property and now lived in the uncertain borderland between bondage and freedom. She recorded every one. 2 of those entries carried fathers' names whispered in the raw intimacy of labor, names that should have belonged to men far from the Langford orbit. 1 name had appeared before. Harriet closed the notebook and sat motionless in the dark for nearly an hour. The candle burned low. Shadows moved across the wall like accusations. She did not weep. She simply understood that the ledger she kept was no longer merely a professional habit. It had become a covenant. In the spring of 1860, before the first shots at Sumter, Thomas had come to her room. He sat in the single chair, avoided her eyes, and asked the question his brother would never dare ask directly. "Do you keep records of the births?" "Yes." "Are they detailed?" "Medically relevant." "Do you record fathers?" She let the silence answer first. Then, "My records are confidential. A matter of trust." He left without another word. The next morning Harriet moved the tin box to a new hiding place she never wrote down. For the first time she allowed herself to imagine the notebooks after her death. She considered fire. She considered it for weeks, long nights staring at the box, weighing destruction against preservation. She chose preservation. Not out of vengeance. Not out of politics. Because she had seen what happened when truth was permitted to vanish. Children erased from lineage. Women left to carry shame in silence. Bloodlines rewritten by convenience. She would not be the instrument of that erasure. She would be its witness. The war ended in 1865. Robert Langford, Thomas and Vivian's son, was 13. Tall already, dark-haired, carrying his mother's watchful intelligence and eyes too old for his face. He was the first Langford in a generation who seemed built for something beyond the plantation. Charles, childless after his own son Edmund Holt died of fever at 4, began to see in Robert the heir he had never produced. Not legally, the entailment was iron, but practically. Funds appeared for tutors. Books arrived from Richmond. Quiet conversations stretched longer. Vivian noticed. She loved her son with a fierce, uncomplicated physical love. Yet she also carried knowledge that cast long shadows across that love. She never spoke of it. Not to Robert. Not to anyone. Only Harriet Voss held the corresponding piece of the puzzle, recorded, locked, silent. In 1867 Charles sent Robert, 16, to Richmond to read law. The arrangement was generous, deliberate, a clear signal of succession. Before he left, Robert came to Harriet's room. He sat in the same chair his father had once used. He looked at her directly. "I've heard you keep records of births." "I do. I don't want details. I think you've seen things here no one else would write down. I think that matters. I wanted you to know I'm grateful you're careful." Harriet studied him. The boy carried weight no 16-year-old should carry. She spoke carefully. "I have always tried to do my work with integrity." He stood. He shook her hand, firm, adult, unprecedented. Then he left. That night Harriet opened her notebook, not for a birth, but for herself. The only personal entry she ever allowed. October 1867. Robert Langford departed for Richmond to study law. He is careful. He is watching. He is Vivian's son. She paused, pen hovering. He may be the only one I can trust. She closed the book. Charles Langford died in the autumn of 1869. Heart failure, slow, announced by shortness of breath and swollen ankles, finally undeniable. He met it with the same composure he had brought to every negotiation, every harvest, every crisis. At the graveside Harriet stood among the household staff, black shawl tight, face unreadable. She watched Vivian support Thomas, now frail, broken, through the ceremony. She watched Robert, 20, stand straight-backed, eyes dry, already measuring what came next. That night she added one line. October 17, 1869. Charles Langford deceased. Heart. Estate and authority passed to no direct heir. Robert watches. Vivian waits. She closed the notebook. Outside, the wind moved through the empty fields like the breath of something ancient, patient, and finally ready to speak. The parlor at Westmere smelled of old wax, damp wool, and the faint metallic bite of grief already turning cold. December 1869. Willis Kramer, the family attorney, gray at the temples, voice flat as river stone, read Charles Langford's will without flourish or apology. Charles had died at 56, methodical to the last breath, arranging his affairs the way he arranged his fields, no loose ends, no sentiment. The estate, now shrunk to under 1,800 acres after war, sales, and the slow hemorrhage of labor, was left entire to Robert Langford, Thomas's son, on condition he finish his legal studies in Richmond and return within 3 years to manage what remained. Charles's daughters, Catherine and young Margaret, received money, generous money, but no land. Land was identity. Land was blood. Land stayed with the name that could carry it. Thomas received nothing new. His allowance continued, unchanged. A quiet codicil in legal ink that said what no one dared speak: his brother had judged him unfit to steward even a single furrow. Thomas sat through the reading without moving. Pale. Still. The stillness of a man whose rage has nowhere left to run. When Kramer finished, Thomas rose, walked out of the parlor without a word, and did not return that night. Harriet Voss watched from the doorway of the adjacent room, summoned in case Vivian needed her, though everyone knew the summons was pretext. She saw the way Thomas's hands trembled at his sides, not with weakness, but with the contained violence of a storm held inside glass. That same night Vivian came to Harriet's room. She sat in the single chair without preamble. The lamp burned low. Shadows clung to the rough plaster walls like witnesses. "I need to speak about something long overdue," Vivian said. Harriet waited. "I'm going to ask something I have no right to ask." "I know I have no right. But I'm asking anyway because Robert must be protected." "Protected from what?" "From Thomas." No elaboration was needed. 27 years of watching the Langfords had taught Harriet the shape of every fracture in that family. She understood what a cornered man like Thomas, stripped of inheritance, dignity, future, might do when the law offered him a thread to pull. She understood what Vivian wanted. Not the notebooks themselves. Not every page of 30 years' worth of births and confessions. Only certain entries. The ones that could prove, in a courtroom, that Robert's place was unassailable. The ones that could make any challenge from Thomas not merely difficult, but suicidal. Harriet was silent for a long time. Then she asked the question she had never permitted herself before. "Why does it matter? What would Thomas find if he looked?" Vivian met her eyes, steady, exhausted, carrying a stone for 18 years. "You know what he'd find. You wrote it down." Silence stretched thin as winter light. "Robert cannot know," Vivian said. "Not if it can be avoided. I want the threat removed without the truth ever spoken aloud. I want the notebooks to exist as a shadow, something people fear without ever seeing." Harriet looked at the wall where moonlight touched the tin box's hiding place. "Will you think about it?" Vivian asked. She left. Harriet did not sleep. She lay in the dark and weighed the purpose of her life's work. She had told herself for nearly a decade that she kept the records because truth deserved to exist, because burning them would be to participate in the same erasure she had witnessed for decades. Children unclaimed. Mothers abandoned to silence. Bloodlines scrubbed clean for convenience. But Vivian was not asking for revelation. She was asking for leverage. For the existence of the record to become a weapon held in reserve, never fired, but always loaded. Harriet thought of the entry from 1852, Vivian's labor, Robert's birth, Thomas named his father. Clean. Lawful. She thought of the entry from 1857 at the tenant farm, Margaret Dyer's boy, father named not Thomas, but Charles. She thought of the entry from late 1863, written during the war's darkest months, when the house was half empty and desperation had stripped away every pretense of decorum. An entry she had reread only twice since. A name she had never expected to write. She thought of Robert, his direct gaze, his handshake, the quiet gravity that made him seem older than 21. By dawn she had decided. She did not give Vivian the notebooks. She did not give her the originals. Over 3 nights, by the weak light of her lamp, Harriet copied the precise entries that mattered. Her hand never faltered. She sealed them in an envelope, plain, unmarked, heavy with consequence. She summoned George Rules, a freedman who had left Westmere in 1864. A man whose 2 children she had delivered. A man whose eyes carried the same quiet respect people reserve for those who have held their trembling newborns. She gave him the envelope and one instruction. Deliver this by hand to Robert Langford in Richmond. Within the week. No post. No intermediaries. Only someone you trust completely. George took it without question. Harriet wrote a short letter to Robert, formal, correct, the kind a midwife might send a young gentleman. Hoped he was well. Hoped his mother was well. Mentioned a trusted communication might arrive. Asked that he treat it with utmost discretion. She posted it. 3 weeks later a note arrived from Robert. Brief. Careful. I have received what was sent. I understand its significance. Please be assured I will handle it appropriately. Thank you, Miss Harriet. She burned the note in the lamp flame. Watched the paper curl black. Then she returned the originals to their hidden place. In February 1870, Thomas Langford quietly withdrew his consultations with a second attorney. No explanation. No public statement. He retreated to the outbuilding rooms, drank, diminished further, and avoided his son. Robert returned to Westmere in the spring of 1870, 21, law degree in hand, the accelerated urgency of Reconstruction Virginia behind him. He took possession with the same measured competence Charles had once shown. On his first evening back, he came to Harriet's room. He stood in the doorway a moment, then stepped inside. "You kept this family honest," he said, "when it could not keep itself honest. I don't know how to repay that." "You don't repay it," Harriet answered. "You manage the land well. That's enough." He nodded once. She believed him. Thomas did not accept defeat quietly. He never confronted. Never accused openly. He simply talked. In Charlottesville taverns. At the courthouse. In the elliptical code Virginia men used when they wanted poison to spread without fingerprints. He implied irregularities in the will. He hinted at questions around Robert's birth. He suggested, never stated, that certain circumstances might alter everything if properly examined. In the fragile social order of Reconstruction Virginia, where race, property, legitimacy, and Reconstruction governance collided like tectonic plates, such hints were dynamite. Thomas believed he was threatening Robert's legitimacy. He was wrong. He feared Harriet had recorded his own sins. Margaret Dyer, the child born in 1857, the bastard he assumed would taint any claim he might make. But the entries Robert received were not about Thomas's sins. One was about Charles Langford, methodical, upright Charles, who in 1856 or early 1857 had lain with Margaret Dyer and left a child no one else documented. Charles, whose will gave everything to Robert. Charles, whose moral authority formed the silent contrast Thomas leaned on to paint Robert as unworthy. If that entry ever surfaced, it would not destroy Robert. It would destroy Charles's legacy. And with it, the entire foundation of Thomas's whispered campaign. Robert understood this the moment he opened the envelope. He did not panic. He acted. He met with Willis Kramer multiple times, details never recorded. He wrote Harriet a careful letter asking if she would confirm certain births in writing, should legal need arise. She replied, yes. He audited every public document, county registers, family Bible, estate papers. Everything confirmed Robert's birth as lawful. Thomas and Vivian, April 19, 1852, delivered by Harriet Voss. Then Robert wrote his uncle one letter. Brief. Legal. Precise. It observed that any challenge to the will would require evidence of family history. Such evidence, once entered into record, would invite examination that might prove illuminating for everyone involved. He sent it by private messenger. Thomas read it. He never replied. He never spoke of it again. The silence that followed was not peace. It was the silence of a family that had stared into its own abyss and chosen to turn away. Thomas died in the spring of 1874-52. The official cause, lingering effects of typhoid, compounded by years of drink. Buried in the family plot. Far enough from Edmund Sr.'s stone that even in death the hierarchy was preserved. The family stood at the grave with faces that expressed something deeper than grief, something closer to relief at burying complication itself. Vivian lived on at Westmere, neither mistress nor guest, simply Robert's mother, occupying rooms that had once belonged to her marriage. Robert married in 1873 Helen Slade, educated, clear-eyed, brisk. She brought to the estate the same disciplined competence Charles had once wielded. Harriet, now 73, practiced less but refused to stop entirely. 450. Births by rough count. 5 notebooks in the tin box, 40 years of truth, complication, ordinary human witness. She thought often about their fate after her death. No children. No close kin. She considered younger midwives who had learned from her. But the notebooks were no longer merely professional. They were weighted with divine accounting. She considered Robert. She trusted him. But trust is not the same as detachment. A man with interest in the contents cannot be their perfect guardian. She weighed the question slowly, patiently, the way she weighed every difficult birth. She did not resolve it before the final years closed in. In the spring of 1875, Harriet Voss purchased a small, cloth-bound journal from the dry goods store in Charlottesville. Not a ledger. Not for accounts or births. A private book, plain pages, modest stitching, the kind a woman might keep for letters never sent or thoughts never spoken aloud. She carried it back to the half-acre cottage Robert Langford had quietly arranged for her when it became clear the narrow room behind Westmere's kitchen could no longer serve a woman of 73 whose knees ached in the cold and whose hands, though still steady, needed rest between calls. She began to write. Not a confession, she had nothing to confess. Not a memoir, she had no interest in her own story as entertainment. She wrote an inventory of truth. Page after page, in the same small, precise hand that had filled 5 ledgers over 40 years, she described. The notebooks themselves, 5 volumes now, dark leather, cream pages yellowing at the edges. How they were organized, chronological, each entry dated to the hour when possible, every mother named as she gave it, every child measured by feel and sight, every father named only when the mother spoke it in the raw vulnerability of labor's peak. The most significant entries, not judged by drama, but by implication, the initials that matched a patriarch, the names that crossed forbidden lines, the births that existed nowhere else in the county's official memory. She wrote where the tin-lined box was hidden now, in the cottage's root cellar, beneath a loose flagstone beneath the cold hearth, wrapped in oilcloth against damp. She wrote that the box's lock required a small brass key she kept on a plain chain around her neck, even in sleep. She left no recipient named. Only a margin note in faint pencil, to be determined. She was not rushing. She was building. Over the next 18 months she composed 3 letters, each different, each incomplete, each a deliberate fragment of a larger design. The first, to Robert Langford, formal, measured, acknowledging their history without sentiment. She described the notebooks in general terms, their existence, their nature as private professional records containing facts no public ledger held. She wrote that the originals would pass to a custodian she trusted. She would name that person separately after her death. She asked him to trust her judgment in how the information would be handled. She expressed quiet confidence that he would. The second, to Francis Hardy, longer, more philosophical. Francis, a Quaker reformer in Philadelphia, had corresponded with Harriet for years on midwifery techniques, herbal preparations, and the moral weight of attending births among the poor and the enslaved. Harriet framed the notebooks now as historical counter-evidence, documents that filled the deliberate silences in the official record, especially the silences around women's lives, enslaved lives, illegitimate lives. She called them a necessary archive of what power prefers forgotten. She asked Francis, should anything befall her, to see that the records were preserved where scholars and legal minds could one day reach them, not for scandal, but for truth. The third letter was the most audacious, addressed to the Albemarle County clerk and his successors in perpetuity. Written in the crisp legal cadence she had absorbed from decades of listening to attorneys like Willis Kramer and Robert himself, it attested to the notebook's accuracy, completeness, and methodology. It listed categories of information without revealing specifics. It requested formal preservation in the county files as a professional record of midwifery practice from 1837 to 1877. She did not send it yet. She folded it into the journal, beside the inventory. She was constructing permanence. October 14, 1877. Harriet Voss died of a swift stroke in the modest bedroom of her cottage. 76 years old. She had spent a lifetime easing others through the narrow gate of birth and death. Her own passage was efficient, undramatic, almost courteous to the body that had served her so long. Robert opened the sealed letter the next day. He found the tin box exactly where she had described. He carried it to the sitting room where the air still held the faint scent of her lye soap, dried herbs, clean linen. He opened the journal. He read the inventory. He read the 1841 entry for Nora El and felt the cold weight of his grandfather settle differently in memory. He read the 1857 entry for Margaret Dyer, Charles Langford, and understood why his uncle had feared the notebooks, and why his father had never suspected the deeper blade. He read the 1863 entry again in Harriet's original hand, the small, unhurried script making the fact more solid, more undeniable. He sat for hours. Then he acted as she had indirectly instructed. He sent the letter to Frances Hardy, enclosing his own note attesting to Harriet's character and the record's historical value. He sent the formal letter to the county clerk, again with his endorsement as executor of her estate. He locked the originals in a cabinet in Westmere's estate office. He told no one, not his mother, not his wife. Not yet. Vivian was 63. She had carried the knowledge for 31 years without ever speaking it plainly. She did not need to be told what the box contained. She had lived inside its shadow since the night she first asked Harriet about Margaret Dyer. Frances Hardy received the letter in Philadelphia in late 1877. She read it with the focused calm of someone who had long suspected the depth of Harriet's record-keeping. She had argued for years, in Quaker circles, in reform meetings, that the history of the South's most vulnerable could only be recovered through the private testimonies of those who had stood beside them in extremity. Harriet's notebooks were exactly that, testimony written in blood, sweat, and ink. In the spring of 1878 she began a careful campaign not to expose, but to preserve. She wrote to colleagues, historians, reformers, early archivists interested in African American and women's history in the post-war South. She described the records in general terms, a midwife's ledger spanning 40 years, containing names, dates, outcomes, and paternities absent from every official Bible and courthouse register. The response was gradual, but real. In 1880, a Philadelphia historian named A.R. Beaumont, specializing in Southern birth practices and social documentation, traveled to Albemarle County. He met Robert Langford. Presented credentials. Made a formal request to examine the notebooks. Robert agreed. Beaumont spent 4 days in the estate office. He read every page. Took meticulous notes. What he published in 1882 was not exposé. It was a scholarly monograph, dry, rigorous, footnoted, aimed at the narrow audience of academics and reformers who cared about methodology and evidence. It named the notebooks. It quoted the 1841 entry Nora El. It quoted the 1857 entry Margaret Dyer, Charles Langford. It omitted the 1863 entry at Robert's quiet request. He allowed Beaumont to note its existence but not its content, on condition the original remained preserved. The monograph circulated quietly. Reviewed in 3 journals. One review reprinted in a Philadelphia paper. That excerpt reprinted in Richmond. From Richmond it reached Charlottesville. 1882 to 1883. Albemarle County did not explode. Old families closed ranks. Some dismissed the work as Yankee meddling. Some acknowledged its historical value while keeping distance. Some felt the deeper disturbance. Written truth has a different permanence than whispered rumor. The Langford name appeared twice in Beaumont's pages. Once tied to Edmund Sr. and Nora in 1841, illuminating the adult life of Nora's son in ways the family Bible never would. Once tied to Charles and Margaret Dyer in 1857, naming a 24-year-old son, James Dyer, working a modest farm in the next county, unaware until that moment that scholarship had claimed him. Catherine Langford, married, living in Richmond with children, wrote to the family attorney. "My father was a man of his time. I cannot pretend otherwise. I refuse to be ashamed of facts that are not my doing, but I will not pretend the facts are not the facts." Margaret Langford, unmarried, still in Charlottesville, returned to Westmere for the first time in years. She sat with Robert and Vivian in the same parlor where Charles's will had been read 13 years earlier. What was said remains unrecorded. Afterward, Margaret traveled to the neighboring farm. She knocked on James Dyer's door. He opened it. Looked at her. I wondered when someone would come. He had always known, not from books, but from the sidelong glances, the silences, the way certain features echoed across county lines. Margaret told him about Harriet Voss. About the notebooks. About what was written. He listened. Then he said. She wrote it down because she thought it should exist. She was right. February 1884. Vivian Langford died at 70. She had outlived Thomas by 10 years, Charles by 15, Harriet by 6. In her final months, bedridden but clear-eyed, she asked Robert to read from Beaumont's monograph. He did, sitting beside her, voice steady through the careful prose. When he finished the relevant passages, she lay silent, eyes closed, hands folded. She was the only one who told the truth, Vivian said. Everyone else was managing something. Robert said nothing. I was managing something, too, she continued. I know that. You were protecting me. Yes. But she wasn't protecting anyone. She was just writing things down. That's different. He agreed it was different. She died 3 weeks later, quiet, practical, undemonstrative to the end. In the years that followed, the notebook's consequences unfolded slowly, like roots seeking water beneath stone. James Dyer became the most sustained voice. Not a scholar by training, but by necessity. He corresponded with Beaumont. With Frances Hardy until her death in 1886. He visited the courthouse, cross-referenced Harriet's formal letter with public records. He saw how private witness and official ledger together revealed what neither could alone. In 1888 he published a short essay in a Philadelphia historical journal, Midwifery Records as Sources for Southern Social History. Modest. Methodical. Argumentative. It made no new revelations beyond Beaumont. It argued instead for the value of such records as correctives to the curated silences of power. Fewer than 1,000 people read it. But they were the right 1,000. In 1896, Harriet's formal letter and certificate of deposit were transferred to the new State Archive in Richmond. Catalogued. Numbered. Filed. No one opened it for 20 years. But it was there. It existed. It had survived. That was what she had built.